Welcome to the Harvard Extension School Psychology Student Society. This is our first official podcast, and I'm really excited to have our amazing advisor, Dr. Max Krasnow. And this is really exciting because we wanted to have something special for Pride Month. And I think this is a really cool way of kicking it off, both Pride Month and our podcast. The title of the podcast today is Sex is Only Binary in the Least Relevant Way, says science. And we're going to get more into that. But before we get started, I just wanted to introduce Dr. Max Krasnow. He is a renowned researcher and professor at Harvard University who holds a PhD in evolutionary psychology and human development. With over 20 years of experience, he specializes in the study of sex differences, including the evolution of sexual reproduction and human mating psychology and sexual diversity. And honestly, that's just a blurb. There's a lot more to the amazing stuff that Dr. Krasno does. But did I miss anything? Would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think that's a great place to start. I've been studying these things, professionally for a long time. They're also, strong personal interests of mine. I teach classes here at the Extension School in helping students to understand the complexity of sex and mating behavior. And I think that this foundational knowledge has the power to help people um, understand this issue and maybe come to more consensus that can really help get us past the current kind of controversies and fights that we have in the culture.
Awesome. Thank you for agreeing to do this. I think it can help a lot of people. And also, I think there's just maybe misinformation out there. For example, how can you define what is a man or a woman? Or can it be self evident, like some suggest? And when laws claim to be grounded in science and biology, are they actually looking at scientific definition of sex?
Those are excellent questions, and I think those are exactly the first questions that we should tackle. And again, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure. So I think that when we look at a lot of the discourse that happens, especially when you hear those kinds of things, that it's obvious that there's only men and women, that sex is binary, and that it's self-evident, and that that's what the science says. That's really the product of our intuitions. It's a product of our psychology. There's a lot of social psychology around person perception that shows that categorizing others on the basis of sex is part of our intuitive psychology. But on the other hand, if you actually look at the science of sex and gender, it is nowhere near that simple. I think the way to start to introduce this topic is to understand that you have to approach it from several levels of analysis because there's not just one way of understanding what sex and gender mean for humans. So, right now, what I'm going to talk about are a theoretical biological level of analysis, a genetics, biology, and anatomy level of analysis, and then a psychological level of analysis. And when I say that sex is only binary in that least relevant way, that's the way that we're going to start with. And so the first claim that I'm going to make is that there is a way in which sex is binary. Okay, so here's how we get there. If we go back more than a billion years, several billion years in fact, all the way to the origin of life on planet Earth, that life was asexual. That means our ancestors, and we do have genes from those original replicators that got passed all the way down to us, those original life forms made copies of themselves by cloning so that the offspring that they had were genetically identical to themselves. There was no sex, using that word in the form of like intercourse or even the exchange of genes. There were not distinct sexes. There was not male and female. There was just one form that made copies of itself. And that was the only way that life reproduced for around a couple billion years. And that story didn't really change until about a billion years ago. About a billion years ago, our ancestors started to become multicellular, meaning that there was more than just a single cell living on its own. And after we became multicellular, there started to be selection pressures that caused the differentiation for some species into different sexual, and the word here is morph, different sexual kinds. Now, if you look at humans, when we talk about morphs, we're talking about differences in these big bodies that we have. But at this time point, about a billion years ago, when I'm saying morph, what I'm meaning is the size of the genetic material packet that's being exchanged or that's being combined between two parents in order to create an offspring. Because that is the specific place where we first get sexes, meaning more than one form engaging in sexual reproduction. If we look around the world today, there are lots of sexual species, lots of species where two parents mix their genes to create offspring. There's lots of sexual species that have two different morphs, that there's one kind of member of that species that creates, little small packets of genes that we typically call sperm, and other members of the species that create large packets of genes that we call eggs. And then there's also lots of species on the planet that engage in sexual reproduction, meaning two parents combine genes to create offspring, but they don't have different morphs. Every member of that population is sexually compatible with every other member of that population. They don't come in one or two kinds, or any more than one kind. And then we still have lots of asexual producers on the planet, lots of like fungi, mushroom spores and stuff, asexual reproduction. Okay, so we have this minority of species, or this, at most plurality of species, that are sexually reproducing and have distinct sexual morphs. And they're distinct only in this sense of large packet of genes and small packet of genes. There's a theoretical biological model, and by model I just mean math, that shows why this tends to happen. And the gist of how this model works is that there's essentially a war between the parents in who has to do more. Now, if you look at, your own family or your own parents, or even if you've ever worked in a group setting, you know that there's a ever-present problem of who's going to take on the work. And if any one person can get away with free riding, can get away with doing less, can get away with shirking, there's clearly reason to do that. And that's essentially the same thing that led to males and females. Males are by definition the sex that shirks on that size of that gene packet. And by virtue of doing that, they're able to make many, many more of those and potentially have many, many more offspring. Females, by definition, in this theoretical biological sense, are the ones that take on the lion's share of that genetic contribution, that contribution to the initial cell that forms the offspring. And early in the history of sexual reproduction, it's that specific dynamic that led to two sexes. And this is sexes defined in terms of the size of that gene packet, and another word for that is gamete, that they produce. And so across sexual species where you do get different sexual morphs, this is essentially what you see. One of them makes a small one. We tend to call that sperm. And the ones that make sperm we call males. And one of them makes eggs. And the ones that we call eggs, we call female. This is the biological definition of sex. That's where it starts and that's where it stops. Okay, so at this level of analysis, we have a sexual dichotomy. But this is probably the place that most people didn't intuitively get to when they were thinking about why they think that sex is binary, right? Why do they think that males are obviously male and females are obviously female? It probably wasn't this that they had in mind. And it's probably not this that is actually relevant to most people's lives most of the time. And that's why I say, or that's why I suggest, that the way in which sex is binary is, in fact, the least relevant aspect of sex and gender to the way that we live our lives. Okay, so starting from this platform of a binary, theoretical, biological sense of sex, we then move into an incredibly diverse area of ways that that basically rolls out across species, across time. You have species where the way that those individuals end up getting to be that way, end up developing into a body that produces sperm, where others of them end up developing into a body that produces eggs. Across species, there's many, many ways in which that happens. We're familiar with the mechanism for humans, and the very, very simple version is that we have two sex-determining chromosomes. We have the X chromosome and the Y chromosome, and I'll get into exactly why it's not that simple in a bit, but we have that kind of genetic sex determination mechanism. There are other species that use different chromosomes. Sometimes it's the presence of one chromosome that does it, or the absence of one chromosome that does it. There are some species that, as they're young, develop into one sex, and only given a particular environmental cue, like whether they're the biggest one in their group, like is the case for some fish, will they then transition into the other sex. They'll become male, or for other fish, they'll become female after starting out life as a male. For lots of reptiles, there's an environmental cue that's not social, but it's more of like a physical cue. What's the temperature of the environment in which those eggs were created and laid? That's the thing that determines the sex of that offspring. And so even just starting with that small set of examples, we can see that what sex means in nature in terms of the bodies that get built and how those bodies end up that way, it's not anywhere near as simple as what we intuitively kind of think. Focusing in on humans, I think this is really where the complexity and the diversity starts to really go crazy, because science over the last couple of decades has discovered amazing things. For example, we kind of have the intuition that if you're a male, that every cell in your body has that same male set of genes. And if you're a female, you have that opposite case, that every cell in your body has those double X chromosomes. It turns out that all of us, to a very small degree, and some of us to a larger degree, are mosaics. That we actually have within us some proportion that's greater than zero of cells that have a different sexual profile in terms of those underlying genes than you would think. How does this happen? It turns out that while we are all gestating, while we're all in the uterus of our mother, there is an exchange of cells between that mom and that baby. And those cells from mom end up in the baby, and they end up reproducing. They end up making copies of themselves that end up, surviving over time, that you can find in the brains and bodies of that offspring as they grow up. So if you're a male, you have cells from your mom, female cells, right? Cells that have those double X chromosomes. And well, you could say, well, I'm a female, right? I'm a woman. And so I would only have gotten those female cells from my mom. Well, it turns out that there's an exchange of cells that goes the other way, such that if you have an older brother, that brother, when he was, when your mom was pregnant with him, he passed cells to her that can then end up in you. And so you can end up with male cells in a female body, or male cells in a body that is mostly made up of female cells by virtue of that mechanism. And those are just two of the mechanisms, of the pathways in which you can get this mosaic of cells across the body. That mosaicism tends to be relatively sparse, but it's very common. The places where it gets to be a higher percentage of our cells in our body is cases where you have early developing twins that then fuse, even before you could detect a heartbeat. There's an interesting case of a man who had cause to have a paternity test of for the son that he had thought was his. And what came back from that genetic test was that it didn't look like he was the father. It looked like a very close genetic relative, like a father or a brother of his, was the father. But they knew that that was impossible because he didn't have a brother. What happened? Well, where did that kid get those genes? They got those genes from his sperm, which were made by his testicles. Where did the doctors get the sample from him in order to compare those genes to? They got it from his saliva or from his blood. It turns out that he was one of those fused twins, two males in this case, such that one lineage of cells that ended up being sampled for the father sample came from one of those siblings, and the cells that went on to create his testicles and eventually his sperm that were passed on to his child, those came from the other sibling. So I think that's a flagrant example of how our bodies are made up of cells that come from different, what we would think of as people. And those different people can be a different sex than the one that we think that we are, the one that we have that gender identity for, the one that our body, conventionally looks like. So I think that is a kind of particularly mind-blowing way that science has shown that sex, even when you're looking at a cell-by-cell composition of the genes in our body, can differ, can vary, where we have mixes of cells that have an XY profile and cells that have an XX profile. If we think about those genes, though, what is it actually that differentiates those who go on to be recognized as men, who produce sperm, those who go on to be recognized as females that produce eggs? We have this intuition that there's lots of genetic differences between men and women, but it turns out that's not true. Men and women, our bodies are created by essentially the exact same set of genes, except for a very small number. Scientists are still kind of debating whether it's 1 or whether it's 3 or whether it's 6, but it's a very small number of genes on the Y chromosome that essentially flip a switch in development, such that some of our other genes start to work in a different way than they would if the switch was not flipped. You could think of it like when you go to install a program on your computer and you select the language, right? If you click English, you'll then go on to have an English speaking program, one that has all the menus and stuff in English. If you had selected Spanish, you would go on to have a Spanish speaking program. It's not that those programs had entirely different code, right? They all came from something that had identical code. And the only reason why it went on to have one appearance or the other is because of a switch that was set early on in the deployment of that program. We're essentially the same way. So men and women don't differ from each other in their genes to any large degree. Like we're talking about less than 10 genes different in the context of millions of genes, tens of millions of genes. Tiny, tiny percentage of our genes that are different from each other. Okay, so if that's how we start out genetically, how do we then get from that small number of genetic differences to bodies that we look at each other and we see so many differences? It turns out what those genes do and what that switch that gets flipped ends up causing essentially the same set of tissue to go down one developmental path or the other. But if you look at the tissues and the hormones and the receptors that are involved in that development, it's not an all or none thing. You can have tissues that are relatively more sensitive to the hormone that's the result of the switch, meaning that it will make that development in a stronger differentiated pattern. You can have tissues that are less sensitive. They maybe have less receptors for that hormone, causing them to have a less extreme differentiation of that tissue. That's true from the earliest points of development, say like week 8, week 10, week 12. Even at that point, we're seeing a diversity of the kinds of bodies that are being built. It's not that every body that's going to be born and identified as a female looks the same to the same degree as every other body, right? We see a spectrum between bodies that are very clearly going to go on to have a penis, bodies that very clearly are going to go on to not. That is true across all of development. As we go through our mom's third stage of pregnancy, we still have that spectrum of effects. In the early stages of infancy, when we have waves of hormones that cause development and that starts to, on average, differentiate the bodies of males and females, again, there's a spectrum in how that works. We have a spectrum in the waves of hormones around puberty. A spectrum in the ways that our tissues respond to those hormones. We end up with bodies that, yes, if you look at the averages of what we identify as males and what we identify as females, we can see differences. But when we look on an individual by individual basis, we see a spectrum. And so if your notion of what biology means when it comes to a biological definition of sex is what the body looks like, you would not come to the conclusion that sex was binary. The last thing that I want to say before I turn the mic back to you, Kimia, because I realize I've been talking for a while,
No, that was wonderful. Keep going.
is that a lot of the time, what people point to is the ways in which what we call men and what we call women, and I'm going to go ahead and just reduce my language just for the sake of ease of talking. I'm just going to be saying men. I'm just going to be saying women. When we look at the ways that men and women differ in, say, how risk prone they are, or how much they have a self-concept that involves them having a strong math ability, or how well they test on tests of verbal reasoning, etc., how interested they are in playing in one toy or another. When we think about those behavioral differences, our intuition is that all of those things tend to hang together, such that there's a particularly boy profile and a particularly girl profile. And when researchers have done the studies where they've, within people, measured all of those traits, averaged them within a person, and compared the averages of males and the averages of females, they do in fact find that there's a difference between those averages. However, when researchers have actually looked at this and measured these traits and behaviors for different people, when they've gone on a trait by trait basis, they do actually see those differences in the averages. So if you look at, say, risk proneness, you will see that on average, men have higher risk proneness than women. You would identify that as a sex difference. However, if you look within a person and you kind of take each of those sexually differentiated traits that differ at that trait level between people, and you kind of code it for which direction is the male direction and which direction is the female direction. And then you take an average within each person, such that if it was the case that men not only tended to be more risk prone, but men would also be uh, taller and have more muscle mass and have more math self-concept and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, have more sexual interest in women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you would have expected that all of those things would have hung together into a tight male package, and all of the female traits direction, the female direction on those traits would have hung together in a tight female package, that would actually be wrong. Because when you take those averages within a person and you compare those averages then between the group of identified men and the group of identified women, you find that that difference in the averages within person are very small and sometimes undetectable. That within a person, they have some traits where they lean in the male direction, some traits where they don't lean so far in that direction, and likely some traits where they lean in the other direction. That even within a person, you don't have a coherent set of traits, a coherent profile of traits that paints a clearly male, uniformly male picture or uniformly female picture. So, not just when we're talking about the genes in the body, and not just when we're talking about the anatomy of the body, but when we're talking about the psychology of that body, the behavior and the brain and the way that it thinks, at all of those levels, we see diversity. And if you think about the way that you live your life, the way that you interact with people, whether that person's friendly or aggressive or, makes a good romantic partner, those don't have to do with that theoretical biological definition, right? That's the least relevant thing to our social relationships, to our friendships, to any of the interesting and important ways that we interact with each other in the world. In all of those other important ways, sex isn't a binary, it's a spectrum.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I bet that was a lot of information that most of us hadn't received in our science classes. So I think that's very educational and helpful. And I think you kind of touched on this, but just want to see if there's any more that you want to explain on this. Why do you think that so many people think that it's really obvious that boys are boys and girls are girls? Or is it a lot more complicated? I think from what I got right now was that it's a lot more complicated. But for, for many that say boys are boys and girls are girls, how would you speak with them about that?
Yeah, great question. And yeah, the framing that you were kind of alluding to, the way that you were thinking about it is, if sex is so complicated, why do we have this intuition that it's simple? And this really is a question about our psychology of person perception. This is not something that we tend to think about in our day to day lives, but there's a reason why Animals don't look at us and see us in the same way that we see each other, and that computers don't look at us and see us in the same way that we see each other. We have a human specific brain, and that human specific brain generates a human specific psychology. And part of that psychology is the psychology of how we perceive each other, that psychology of person perception. When researchers have looked at the details of our psychology of person perception, they found that that psychology operates as if what we're perceiving are categories. And there's theoretical models as to why that's a good way of proceeding. If things come in categories, then you can make decisions. This is kind of why in medicine we have categorical diseases, because if you detect that someone has a disease, then you can act with a intervention. You can give a medicine, or you can give a treatment or a surgery. You can give a particular kind of therapy, or insurance will cover it if that particular disease has been diagnosed. But everyone who actually works in the trenches of medicine will tell you that none of these things are clear categories. Everything is on a spectrum. And the problem with those spectrums is, how do you have a decision? You're going to have to, at some point, give the surgery, and at some point not give the surgery. But where do you draw the line in that spectrum? And do you have to draw it in the same place every time? The way that our brains simplify that process, and the way that the insurance industry has simplified that process, and the way that the medical profession has simplified that process, is to take that underlying true state of the world, a diverse spectrum, and simplified it to categories. And so that is something that our psychology imposes on the world. The world gives us a diversity of different kinds of bodies and behavior, and what our brains do is looks out and sees categories, sees male, sees female. And it turns out that those categories of sex, those are not just random. If you look across cultures, if you look across ages, categorizing other people on the basis of sex seems to be one of the first things we do when we encounter people. And it seems to be one of the most automatic things that we do, meaning that we do it even without thinking about it. In fact, even if we weren't trying to do it, our brains do it anyway. We automatically categorize others on the basis of sex. Why? Why is that design there? We're not good at categorizing, say, baby chicks on the category of sex. We don't have any particular psychology that does that. We're not even particularly good at doing that. But we have one for when it comes to humans. Why? Well, if you think about what opportunities we present to each other, those opportunities tend to differ on the basis of sex, right? Particularly when it comes to reproduction. If you are trying to create an offspring, then picking a partner that makes the opposite morph of gene package, that would be the one that would make a fruitful reproductive partner. And that is the piece that natural selection has acted on every single generation, every single species that has had sexual morphs since the dawn of the evolution of sexual morphs. That has been a consistent problem for practically 1 billion years. And so what we have is a psychology that's the result of that. Because it was such an important problem to identify sexually compatible partners, we have brains that automatically apply those categorizations. But again, we don't reproduce with most of the people we interact with. We don't reproduce with even the most of the people who we could reproduce with, of the people we interact with. That's simply not a relevant factor for most of the people we interact with in most of the ways we interact with them in our lives. So again, the only way that sex is binary is not the relevant way in which sex operates in our lives.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And thank you for explaining it so well and so easily, because I know for a Harvard professor, I know you are capable of explaining it in much more scientific terms. But I think the way you explain it is easy for anyone, even for kids, to understand this. And I really appreciate that because it makes it accessible language for everyone. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I hope that this is being clear. It's always a challenge for me.
And then, so the other question I have for you is, why do you think that we are seeing such a concentrated push for LGBTQ plus legislation right now?
Yeah, I think that's also a great question. I mean, it's again, I think we want to compare our intuitions with what we would kind of expect if we weren't members of our culture, right? Kind of what would we think if we walked into a culture that was not our own, acting kind of as an anthropologist, and we saw people acting like this, but it wasn't the culture we came from? What would we think? Um, it feels like very understandable when we look around the world right now, or look around our country in particular, and we feel the animosity between people on different sides of the debate. We feel the concerns that people have. People express, you know, very strong passions around these issues, that there's a harm if this policy gets passed. There's a harm if this policy doesn't get passed. People have these very strong feelings. And again, if we kind of step back, it's often hard to understand how these feelings are based in reality, right? It's hard to understand why, of all of the issues that are facing us, right? We've just come through a pandemic. We've had a homelessness problem for decades and decades and decades. We have environmental issues that are more important. We have international issues that are more important. Why are we spending so much effort all of a sudden on these issues? And again, just like when we kind of faced that question of how, when the world gives us a diversity of sex, what is it about our psychology that hallucinates categorical sex? I think we should ask the question, what is it about our psychology that takes a world with all of these features and reliably, at least right now, is outputting these strong, passionate emotions, a tribal divide, and conflict between those tribes? The psychology that I think is involved here is what psychologists have called the psychology of intergroup bargaining or intergroup relations. And I think that the dynamic here is best understood at the level of two people interacting with each other. And we'll see how that's going to extend to two groups of people interacting with each other with very small numbers of modifications. So, the simple thought experiment I'd like you to kind of imagine is think about two dogs fighting over a bone. There's one bone, they both can't have it, only one of them can have it. But one of them is much, much bigger than the other. Do you have an intuition of which one's going to win? You probably do. Do you have an intuition of, if they fought, which one would get more hurt? You probably do. And those are, again, when you go back to the theoretical biology, when you go back to the math modeling, those are the factors that are important when it comes to personal bargaining. Who wants the resource the most? And who has the most power to fight for it? The power to inflict pain on the other. Because if you can inflict a lot of pain on the other, they're more likely to give it up. And if you're more willing to put in the effort to inflict pain because you care about that thing so much, they're more likely to give it up. So we have this psychology of bargaining that inherently considers power. How powerful is one party and how powerful is the other. And what this psychology outputs are our feelings of deservingness. Who deserves what? Our feelings of entitlement. What are we entitled to and what are we not entitled to? We feel entitled to things that, based on this intuitive power calculation, we think are ours because if we fought for them, we would get them, and that other people wouldn't fight us for them. It's not that these thoughts are explicit. Nobody's going around thinking about every single thing they see in the world. If I fought over it, who would get it? But that's actually something that our brains are essentially acting as if they're doing. That our feelings of entitlement, ownership, deservingness are all being affected by this intuitive bargaining psychology that is attributing who deserves what, who's entitled to what, on the basis of this power. Now, again, let's now not think about dogs fighting one-on-one. Let's think about dog packs. You have a dog pack of 3, say German Shepherds, just for, convenience, and then a dog pack of 50 German Shepherds. If they were fighting, which group do you think would win? We all probably share the intuition that it's the larger group. And it's because, again, they have more power to inflict pain. They have more of the power in that situation. And so this is the circumstance that we're in. We have a political reality where we have groups of people that have different levels of power in society. And particularly around LGBTQ plus issues, that power is really asymmetric. The majority of people don't find themselves in a situation where a policy being considered is going to have a negative impact on them. In fact, maybe that policy being considered would have a positive impact on them, something they feel entitled to because of that power. And because they perceive that the other side of that fight is a minority, has relatively low power, they feel like it's something that they can do because what is the other side going to do? They don't have enough power to fight back. And again, just like we weren't thinking this explicitly when we're walking around the world, when we're seeing that last donut on the table, when we're seeing, whatever thing in the world that we feel like is ours, feel like we deserve, feel like we're entitled to. It's not like we're thinking about who's going to win in a fight, who's going to win in a fight, who's going to win in a fight. But we have those intuitions anyway, because our brains are acting as if that's what it's thinking about. That same process plays out for these intergroup conflicts. That when we are considering whose preferences and whose pain should win out at the end of the day for a particular policy question, who should get to play on a sports team, who should get to go into a bathroom, who should be able to read books to kids in a library. Part of the way that our brains think about that is in terms of the relative power between the groups. And so even if a dispassionate look at the underlying situation wouldn't lead you to think that a situation was actually causing harm to anybody, by virtue of that differential power, it's going to make you feel like you deserve to get it that way anyway.
That was interesting. Thank you. Actually, based on that, just listening to you, I have another question. It's related to that. And I'm just wondering because, this is something that's been going on for probably thousands of years, as we were talking about, is evolution that kind of led us to see like male and female almost instantly, most likely because of reproduction. But if this is something that has been going on for so long, I think even in like Greek writings, we can find things that there was such a thing as homosexuality, and it was definitely, well, the way to say it, it was okay with them, at least it was maybe even celebrated. So I'm wondering how come just now we're starting to kind of pick this up and like fight for the LGBTQ plus community, and how come it wasn't earlier, or a reason that it suddenly picked up, or I'm just wondering why didn't we start sooner, basically.
Yeah, it's a great question. And society obviously goes through periods where the pendulum swings. I mean, I'm a firm believer that if you stand back far enough, the arc of history bends towards justice and liberty for all, it bends towards the good. But when you step in and look at that arc, it's a very jagged arc. There are certainly things about culture, idiosyncratic things that are going to vary over time and that vary between different places that are going to cause um, one issue to pop in one place as opposed to another. Because we are a groupy species, we do a lot of our social behavior in groups, and we have a lot of these between group interactions. We have a psychology that looks for opportunities for carving out groups that are beneficial to us. It's kind of like um, if you imagine a world where some people have the preference to have the toilet paper roll head over on the outside of the roll, and some people have the preference of having the toilet paper roll come out under the underside of the roll. In the world that we live in now, that's going to feel like an arbitrary distinction that doesn't really motivate passions. We're not having a cultural fight over that. We're not proposing laws about that. But other times, those particular things carve out differences between groups. Like, if it was the case that every Democrat did it one way and every Republican did it the other way, and that became a mark of which group you were in, all of a sudden, that otherwise arbitrary feature becomes something that should motivate your passions. Because you can then look at how someone does their toilet paper to understand what group they're in. And you probably have very different feelings about them depending on what group they're in. And so, what started out as a potentially arbitrary behavior or preference became something that is culturally charged and arousing of our passions, something that we might fight over, something that we might disown family members for, something that we might impose laws because we're fighting against others, fighting over that power.
I think the last question that I have remaining, I mean, there's a lot to talk about, obviously, but just because of
Obviously.
time, what would you tell someone who wanted to help?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's lots of ways that people can help. There's, you know, so many things that people can do. Um, I think maybe one thing, and I hope that this podcast might help someone, be able to explain this to someone else. Because what I have found is that that's what it takes. It's not going to be the case that a book comes out and all of a sudden everyone has read the book, and by virtue of one person talking, everybody else is now convinced. But if you talk to your parents, if you talk to your friends, if you talk to people that trust you and care about you and empathize with you, and because of that, they're able to listen to you. I have a hunch that explaining some of these things might have a chance of changing their mind. And precisely because power for humans is a numbers game, our intuitions are very sensitive to those numbers relations. Think about the fight for marriage equality. It seemed like it was hopeless a couple decades ago. It seemed like we were going to have to fight for every single person to agree, that we were going to have to fight in every state, state by state, person by person. But that wasn't the case. As minds changed, there seemed to be a tipping point where once enough people thought that marriage between people of the same sex should be legal, then it just happened, and that carried along a bunch of other people. Because now that impression of the power relationship wasn't so one-sided. There wasn't that same feeling of entitlement. There wasn't that same feeling of this is an issue that marks these two coalitions where by virtue of being in this coalition, I have power over you. And so I think that at the very least, this is something that I hope someone who's listened to this podcast can do. That they can take what they've learned and they can talk to somebody. And by changing one person's mind, you're getting us closer to that critical edge where we can change society.
Perfectly said. Thank you. My goal is for people from both sides to hear each other, and so hopefully they can work things out better together instead of keep separating each other and not seeing each other as so much of humans, but seeing each other through lenses of problems and different beliefs and this and that. So do you have any suggestions of how to talk about topics without separating people into categories?
Yeah, I think that's a really tricky situation, and it's one that so many of us find ourselves in. In particular, like whenever you start to think about the pragmatics of changing minds, that is going to lead you to a different way of behaving than if what you're trying to do is have a political fight. Because political fights seldom change minds.
Mm-hmm.
So there's two things that I think are the underlying dynamics of that kind of argument, and I think they may suggest a solution, or at least a partial solution. One of them is that we tend to have rich inferences on sparse behavior. Let me pull that out into bigger words, into more words. You know, if it was that case that by virtue of seeing how your toilet paper was hung in your bathroom, all of a sudden I knew all of your political beliefs because I knew that you were of one political party or the other. Like that's a perfect example of very small amount of information led to lots of understanding about somebody else. That's the kind of thing we do all the time. And we especially do that in these group on group ways in how we treat people within our group and how we treat people outside our group. Like if I was a militant and I was rude and nasty to every person on the opposing side, people in my group would be very clear on my allegiance. They would be very clear on who I cared about. And so one problem that engaging in open communication across group lines poses is that it's not that good of a signal to the in-group of where your allegiances are and who you care about. And so one way of fixing that, a hack, is to pair those signals together. Clearly show that empathy and clearly demonstrate your allegiance, while at the same time clearly being open to that intergroup communication. That's going to look different for different people. That's going to look different for different relationships. I think that satisfying that can help neutralize the outrage that people can feel that can get in the way of these more productive intergroup discussions. The other thing that I think is at play is that we use the word ally to mean lots of different things. And even when someone is on a particular side, it's unclear what that means they'll do, right? You know, we are frequently accusing each other of virtue signaling, basically taking effortless, cost free sides of issues and doing things that just show that we've taken that side without actually doing anything. I think I'm going to borrow a few words from a few different movements and a few different disciplines, but I think it would be helpful to have a bigger universe of terms that we can use and thoughts that we can use to think about where people are in their allyhood. On the one hand, you have people who are completely unaware. These are people who are not going to be able to agree with you because they don't know the basic facts. They're not aware of what it means, for example, to be trans. They're not aware of the experience of a trans kid. Moving that person to aware can be the first step in bridging the relationship, getting them to see. That should help move them from a place of antagonism, fighting, to a place where at least we can see the humanity in each other. Being aware doesn't mean that they're an ally, right? You can be aware without saying that you're on their side and that you're going to help them. And so I think we want to differentiate aware from this more narrow category of ally. Because an ally is someone who's on your side, right? That ally is that person who will take those actions, right? They'll show up for the parades. They'll donate for the cause. They'll do those kinds of things to have solidarity with you. But even ally is not as far as we can go. And here's where I'm going to take a term that's been used more in the social justice movement, particularly in racial justice. And this is the term accomplice. Because if you think like, in a war, your ally is not going to jump into the foxhole with you. They're not going to go and do something super costly on your behalf. They're not going to be initiating the action. But your accomplice will. Your accomplice is someone who cares about you enough to put their money where their mouth is and to independently act on your behalf. And so my challenge to people, particularly those who identify as allies, see if you can walk in the direction of accomplice. Because that's, I think, the thing that particularly communities that are minoritized, and this is a phrase, that's a word that I think a lot of people might react to and think, why is that? Why do you have to have a fancy word for minority? Minority reflects that numbers difference. We can understand that a minority means a low power group. But in this culture, we don't just have low power groups. We have groups that we are actively putting in low power positions, right? By virtue of engaging in these culture wars and having these laws and changing people's rights, taking rights away, we're not just looking at them as minorities, but we are further minoritizing them because we're taking away their power. Okay, so if you are someone who considers yourself an ally to a minoritized group, a more effective way of being that ally is to ask yourself, what would an accomplice do? What would I be doing if I was in that situation? What would I want to do? What would I want others to do on my behalf? That should be the standard that we hold ourselves to as allies. And I think that's what the people that we are allies of hope that we'll do.
I think that was said really well, and it was very eye opening. So, yes, I think definitely hear the word ally thrown around often, but to kind of think about it as if you were in their shoes, what would you do or what would you want others to do? I think that would be the really true definition of an ally, really, rather than, I don't know. I mean, I appreciate that people have pride months and this and that, but to actually put the work in it and kind of walk with others who are going through something and are seeking support, I think that would be a true ally, like you mentioned. So thank you for that. That was very informative.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming on and being on our very first podcast. And I'm really excited that we touched on a topic that's really important and I don't think it's talked about enough, and especially scientifically. So I really appreciated how you spoke about it, and it was really informative.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's a topic that I'm really passionate about, both academically, personally, kind of where my passions are, and I think it's something that, like you say, it doesn't get enough attention. People don't know enough about it. Um, if you want to know more, I actually teach two classes at HES that are around this topic. In the springs of each year, I teach my evolutionary psychology course. And coming this fall, for the first time in the Extension School, I'll be teaching a graduate seminar on sex, gender, and evolution, where we'll be going into pretty much everything I've discussed today and more over the course of a term.
Perfect. Thank you. And just so the audience will know, I had never heard about evolutionary psychology before taking your class, and it was so eye opening. It introduced me to a whole new side of psychology, a new way of thinking. And that's why I really appreciate everything that you do and everything you introduce students to, because it's not a topic that I think is often spoken, but it's such a major part that it's being overlooked if people are not taking this class, if people don't have this information. And maybe if you have time, maybe we can eventually also do a podcast about evolutionary psychology, because when I bring it up, a lot of people are like, "What is that?" And I was like, "Oh, you have to take his class." So, yeah, thank you for first of all putting your time into creating those classes, and also for agreeing to help students so much. I know you go above and beyond for your students to teach them, to help them with information that is very brand new to them, but you work really hard to make sure that they understand it. And I really appreciate that. And I'm sure the students appreciate it very much as well.
Oh, thank you.
I'm hoping you'll be back because I know you have a lot of information to share. So,
Yeah, we have lots of ideas for fun podcasts. Yeah.
all right. Thank you.